Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and start, even though we have a small audience, maybe others will trickle in. We are videotaping, so, and we're also broadcasting live down to Colorado Springs, so welcome to whomever is in the audience there. I'm Carol Runyon. I'm a faculty member here in the School of Public Health and direct the PIPER program, which stands for Pediatric Injury Prevention Education and Research Program. And I'm very pleased that today we have a special guest from the Bay Area in California with us, Mark Perchuk. And I'll just give a brief introduction, and I'm sure he'll say a little bit more about his background as part of his presentation. Mark is trained as a lawyer from American University and has many years' experience working in community organizing, grassroots movement building, and I'm just learning the distinctions between them from him, so I'll let him work that out. But he's currently the director of Grassroots Change, an organization based in Oakland, California. Formerly, he was president and executive director for a number of years of Americans for Non-Smoker Rights and the Americans for Non-Smoker Rights Foundation in Berkeley. He's also been active as the executive director of the Marin Institute, which focuses on alcohol abuse. He was an advisor to the Million Mom March and has served as legislative director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence in Washington, as well as other roles in public health advocacy and grassroots change. So he's here today. The title of his talk, Grassroots Movement Building in Public Health and Safety, Lessons from Successful Movements for Gun Control and Fire Prevention. And I will turn it over to him and to explain more of what that all means. He's going to present for a short while and then take questions. And we want to not forget the folks we can't see in Colorado Springs, so make sure we know if you have a question there, and we'll do whatever needs to be done technically to switch it over to you. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Carol. Can you hear me well? Good. And thank you for coming out through the snow to come to this. I really appreciate it, and look forward to your questions and your comments. I'd like to start with a little bit of an overview of the work that we do. The current work, the organization Grassroots Change, Connecting for Better Health, really began in 2009 and was a project called Preemption and Movement Building in Public Health, funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And initially, we set out to research a couple related questions. One was the very basic question, which really hadn't been answered, which is, what is a grassroots health or public safety movement? And is it different? And if so, how is it different from community organizing or different from coalition building? And so we conducted some research quite carefully in collaboration with colleagues at Tufts University and Johns Hopkins. And then in 2012, we're funded to move into advocacy, supporting grassroots movement, and PreemptionWatch.org. It's a related. Preemption is a legal concept, but it's also a strategic concept that's fairly unique to the federal system in the United States, and it's the question of, to what extent does the federal government take away state or local authority over a particular issue, and to what extent does the state take away local authority over various public health and safety issues? And we were just granted renewal funding through 2016. The interviews that we conducted at the beginning of our work included 18 key informants representing all regions of the United States, and a remarkably diverse group of key informants working on all of these different public health issues and more. In some cases, an individual community organizer, for example, in Pomona, might have worked on 5 of these issues, but then other individuals were issue specific. And they were diverse the one thing that held them together is they needed to have experience and some form of expertise in grassroots movement building and health and safety, and ideally some knowledge and experience with the issue of federal or state preemption. Otherwise, they were all very, very different, ranging from activists, from grassroots organizers in a particular community who worked for 20 or for 25 years on a variety of issues to researchers who research grassroots social movements. So one of the things we discovered in our work is that grassroots movement building and for the most part related issues like local public health authority span virtually every issue that comes up in public health and safety. Just a handful of them: fire, alcohol policy and prevention, school food, of course, tobacco and firearms. And we also, relying primarily on our research, but also on some really wonderful research done by some colleagues and others, like Shannon Frateroli at Johns Hopkins University, who conducts research, among other things, on grassroots, on movements, social movements, in areas like residential fire sprinklers, the fire service, and firearms. But this definition we arrived at drew on those, but it was also original to some of the research we did. So a grassroots health movement is an organized effort to address threats to the health and safety of the community, led by activated citizens and organizations that devote resources to building grassroots capacity. Grassroots movements are usually built around a single issue or concern that energizes individuals who join in common cause. And what's unique about a grassroots movements, as distinct from some other forms of public health intervention or advocacy, is that based on our research and other evidence, there are three components that are pretty essential to building an effective or, quote, successful movement in these areas. One is the passion and genuine engagement of grassroots activists, but it also includes a leadership role for grassroots activists. It's different than other forms of some other forms of intervention in that it's not that the grassroots activists are all agreeing in consensus to what the movement is or what it's doing, but they have a very meaningful, significant role in that. And second of all, strategy, but specifically strategy that works to build grassroots power into a movement. And it means things, and it means one fundamental thing that it means is that the goals of a grassroots movement, in addition to being rooted in the passion of the activists in that movement, need to be significant enough goals that they energize individual activists, but they also have to be in the realm of possibility. They're usually, in my experience, a stretch to some extent. The airline smoking ban was a stretch in 1987 when it passed. At that point, the tobacco industry was enormously powerful in Congress, but it was also it wasn't a crazy goal. It wasn't completely out of the realm of possibility. Being strategic means something different, which is assuming you have a goal for your movement that makes sense. It means that every day that you're engaged, you're sticking to that goal, and everything you do is related to that goal. And you're not being diverted even by the news of the day. You may take advantage of events as they occur, for example, in the prevention of firearms violence. But your actions are aligned with the goal. And finally, capacity. And it means, to some degree, it means money. You do have to have a certain amount of money. Our finding, one of the findings from the research is that movements that are entirely volunteer, that have no paid or professional staffing, tend not to be as effective as those that do have some sort of professional management. But it also means that those involved in leadership roles have have grassroots experience of one kind or another, which leads to having some expertise in grassroots, but simply management of databases and communications, both communications within a movement so that the so-called grassroots leaders are in sort of a constant dialogue with the activists, so that there's not a hierarchy in that sense. It's that every decision that's made is at least informed by input by the grassroots advocates who are the engine of change in the movement. And then external communications, social media, sometimes quote unquote media advocacy or earned media. Carol, do you want me to take questions now or do you want me to go to the end? Well, let me just stop now and also acknowledge that we have others in Colorado Springs and see if there's any questions at this point. Very well. And then again, from the research, these are quotes directly from the interviews, verbatim quotes. Residents and those who are directly impacted by an issue are making change and taking leadership. It's not just one local community struggling, but our struggles are related, connected across communities. We have a broad view of how to move the landscape in fixing the problems. A shared view, I think, is also meant by that. And it's not necessarily just in a community. A grassroots movement is people organizing at the local level to bring about change on a particular issue. And sometimes that starts at the community level and grows to the state level or national or even global. And having talked about what a grassroots movement is, and I don't know that I have a slide about this, but there's some distinction between what's meant by some forms of community organizing and then coalition building, state or local coalition building, and a grassroots movement. There's a lot of overlap, especially between community organizing and grassroots movement building. And among our in the research that we did, among the findings was that community organizing of the type that's associated with Saul Alinsky often is an essential precursor or companion to building a broader grassroots health or safety movement. And this slide represents why is it so important. I haven't said this before, but it's difficult to build grassroots movements. There's a reason that there haven't been that many successful movements in health and safety. There's a reason that there's a lot of things called grassroots. If you read the paper, grassroots efforts for gun violence prevention, grassroots efforts related to the health or safety impacts of hydrofracking. But building a successful movement, going back to the previous slide, takes a lot of work and a certain amount of luck. And it's also an organic process. That is to say, because you're not just using grassroots activists to push your agenda. The grassroots activists are your agenda. Your agenda, to a significant extent, comes from them. It's not something you can control from the top down. You have some control from the top down. But it's an organic process. And the reason we do it is that, in my belief, and this has been supported by our work and others, there's some very unique benefits. Genuine grassroots movement building, what builds a kind of power that often public health and safety advocates don't have. That they're not, in Washington, for example, you're often not coming in as an equally powerful negotiator if you're representing the public health field versus what is often the case, which is an industry or industries that may be opposed to some of those goals. We saw this, the second one. My hometown is Berkeley, California, and just this last week, we adopted a ballot initiative to raise the excise tax on sugar-sweetened beverages, sodas, by 1 cent per ounce. And it passed successfully by a healthy margin, but I was naturally involved in that in some ways, in various ways, in addition to voting. And there's an educational process that occurs through that I've rarely seen replicated through other types of marketing interventions, because you have this ongoing conversation, daily conversation, and it helps that the national beverage industry and companies like Coke and Pepsi are investing, in this case, $7 or $8 million in opposition, because it makes it newsworthy. But there's this there's this education process. At the end of this campaign, you have a lot more than 50-cent tax on a large bottle of soda. You have really moved the dial socially, culturally, around a particular public health issue. Grassroots movements, there is a upward cycle of passion. If you're successful banning smoking in restaurants, then the activists get excited, now we can go to bars. And then the workers get excited. The flight attendants if there was a single engine of success in the airline smoking ban, it was the flight attendants as grassroots advocates. Now it's casino workers. Casino workers in many states are unprotected, and this is a very specialized profession, so they don't really have a lot of choices. And so they're literally forced to sit at a table with 3 people smoking in some cases. So that compassion, and grassroots movements can build the capacity of public health. Again, there's a sustainability. When you change society on a permanent basis, as for example in tobacco control over the past 25 years, that enables the public health infrastructure to do things that it could not otherwise do. So, one of the things that we've done that I'm really pleased about is we conducted a case study that was published in the American Journal of Public Health about a grassroots movement that I knew nothing about, a grassroots safety movement, the grassroots movement for residential fire sprinklers. And it was Shannon Frateroli's work which turned me on to this issue. And what I really liked about the research that we did here was that I knew nothing about it. So I had no as with firearms, I knew a lot about firearms and about attempts to build grassroots movements around firearms and ammunition, but I knew nothing about this. So we started fresh, and we built a team that included real researchers who could advise us on the protocol and how to conduct the research in a way which was valid, and hence it was accepted for publication. What was interesting about this piece of research is that we started, for the most part, not knowing anything about the movement. And when we finally got to the stage of findings and results, there were a lot of lessons from this that were the same, if not identical, to lessons from dozens of other grassroots health and safety movements. I'm not actually going to run through these very quickly, but just to say, residential fire deaths and injuries are a very significant problem, very preventable, and often the injuries, not to mention the deaths, are horrific and very, very expensive to treat in the short term and in the long term. And as you probably realize, there are fires, apartment buildings, office buildings, industrial facilities are widely sprinklered at this point in time, but a lot of single-family homes and townhouses are not. And as a result of that, as you can see from this, 85% of fire deaths occur in 1- and 2-family homes. Automatic fire sprinklers have been around for a long time. They're incredibly effective. They don't go off like they do in movies. They go off precisely when they're supposed to. They were pretty effective in 1896. And now, needless to say, they're both inexpensive and very, very effective. And now there's a specific standard, and it has been for a while. It's a model code that's adopted by states and localities that requires the installation of automatic fire sprinkler systems in all new homes, regardless of whether they're apartments, townhouses, or single-family homes. There was a consensus among those who research and implement fire prevention strategies that automatic fire sprinklers are, as FEMA has said, the most effective fire loss prevention and reduction measure with respect to both life and property. And also, as places like California, my home state, have mandated fire sprinklers in all new home building, regardless of the types of homes. And also, communities are beginning to mandate fire sprinklers in significant remodeling as well. Certain kinds of remodeling are requiring it. What you're seeing is, naturally, the price of installing these is going way, way down. This figure of 161, in some of these states where there are now a lot of companies and a lot of people working in the industry, it's gone down below $1 per square foot. So given the benefits of this to all of us, but especially to families with children, to those who are older, and other special populations, it's very inexpensive for a big bang for the buck. Oh, and also it saves millions and millions of dollars in expenditures towards the fire service. And in spite of losing those jobs, the fire service, for the most part, is very passionate about this. And hence the grassroots movement. It started in 1978, and as you can see from this, in San Clemente, California, these were San Clemente and similar communities around the country, Arizona, Georgia, were rapidly expanding, and they were building a lot. The home builders were building a lot of new homes and developments for the most part. And so this guy, who is still active and lives close to where my office is in California, Ron Coleman, had sort of an epiphany at the time that he was promoted to being a fire chief, and asked, based on his own experience in responding to fatal fires in homes, proposed that San Clemente adopt an ordinance which, in the form of a standard that required, and he did, and that spread very quickly. This was an informal national network of local grassroots advocates around the country, which also some of these early ones enabled evaluations, led to evaluation studies of the cost, and then studies of the savings and the savings in morbidity and mortality. So I'm not going to say too much more about the details, because I want to respond to questions and also comments. But although the fire service, marshals, chiefs, other members of the fire service were the original leaders of the movement for the most part, they were joined later by survivors and victims of burns, the Phoenix Society, and I should also say a number of researchers, who have actively participated in providing evidence, the evidence base for residential fire sprinklers, both in terms of safety, but also in terms of cost. And the upshot of this, the number's larger now, is that there are 368 local sprinkler ordinances. I think it's, I want to say, 34 states. The number's higher now. It's continuing at a steady pace. And as almost always happens in this type of grassroots safety movement, when you reach a critical mass, I think it was 71 ordinances in California. I may be mistaken about that, but I think that was the number. Then the state fire marshal in California promoted, and with the support of the legislature, adopted a statewide standard. So and that happened as well in Maryland, meaning that all new homes, and now the communities, this is an example of many of the principles of grassroots movement building, of the upward cycle of success. So now that California is covered, not the same communities, but some of the same communities are going back and saying, look, if you do a $200,000 renovation and addition to your house, we think it's reasonable to spend $3,500 on something that's going to save tax dollars, and it's going to may save your life and the life of your children or your parents. And so, many interesting lessons, one of which that Carol and I have spoken about, is what might be called the 30-year rule, which is that looking at all of these movements, tobacco control, which really got going about 30 years ago in a meaningful way as a grassroots movement on a national scale. This movement, what were some of the other movements we talked about? Fire-safe cigarettes, grassroots movement to require a very easy and inexpensive modification in cigarettes so that they wouldn't cause as many home fires. But many of these other movements, it's about 30 years from the first real sparks until widespread success. At this stage of the game, I think it's fair to say that very shortly, all new homes will have fire sprinklers, and I think we'll be moving on to more retrofitting issues. For example, funding. There have been innovations in funding for retrofitting homes in poorer communities, so now we've got someone protected who buys a 2,500 square foot house in San Clemente. What about the family that lives in Richmond, California, who lives in an older home, and is at risk? Is at risk? Well, one way to solve that is for the local fire chief, with support from state or national funders, can implement a program to offer free sprinklers to either the landlords or to the tenants directly. So a definition of a successful movement. I'll run through these quite quickly. The lessons. What's interesting about this is that this is the lessons from the AJPH paper on the residential fire sprinklers, but it could be the same lessons, almost essentially the same lessons from any of the movements that we've either studied or that we have personal experience with in my organization and my network. The incredible power of a very small number of people. One of the, I guess if there's a silver lining to the lack of engagement at times in the political process in the U.S. at the state and federal level especially, one is that 10,000 activists nationwide who are well organized and reasonable and have capacity and resources can make an enormous amount of change. It's not really about the numbers, and we find this over and over again with successful movements. When I was working in Washington, D.C., nationally, I got to know the grassroots director for the National Rifle Association because we would debate in public sometimes. And their real base, the NRA's real base of support, was shockingly small to me. It was something like, on the high side, 45,000 nationally. But in terms of successful grassroots movements, that's a lot. With say 20,000, I think we probably had at our peak 25,000 grassroots activists, including flight attendants, engaged in the airline smoking ban, which was the only piece of federal legislation that's ever been passed without either the explicit or tacit approval of the tobacco industry. The other legislation, for example, the FDA legislation was endorsed by Altria, the manufacturer of Marlboro cigarettes. Advocates working in venues where their effectiveness can be amplified. That's oftentimes at the local level, not always. Sometimes it's at the state level. Although the local success leads to state success, as we illustrated. And this gets to the issue of capacity and resources, issues of capacity and resources. In a grassroots movement, national organizations or state organizations can provide very useful types of support, like media tools, for example, would be one example. Model press releases, one-page fact sheets for example, about those can be provided without making it into a top-down effort. This is sort of at the heart of it, which is that the kinds of changes that can come out of an effective grassroots movement can be really fundamental core changes, not just in policy, but in culture, in social norm. And hence there can be a reason to be patient. We're not talking about preemption today. It's in the fire sprinkler case study, in a short span of time that has ended, I believe, 13 states passed preemption of local authority over residential fire sprinklers. It's actually the first time we think that any state has ever taken away local authority over fire codes where communities already retain that. In other words, it was a unique, you might say, power grab. But because the movement had progressed at that point so far, 360, 370 ordinances, the advocates in the fire prevention field were able to stop the state preemption at 13, and the proponents of that, which has tended to be the National Association of Home Builders, which represents these big home building companies, I think have backed off. And one reason is I think that once you get to a certain point with this, then you have a litigation issue, which is that if someone is severely injured in a preventable fire in a new home, and it was known to the home builder that $4,000 system would have entirely prevented that injury, that could lead to unbelievable damages for things like pain and suffering beyond. So I think that there's I think it's never over with preemption because it's such a central strategy, but this has been a successful movement, and I believe with a successful outcome. Of course.
So, do you think that the efforts to do preemption are in some ways a marker of the success of the movement at the local level, or are preemption movements sometimes preemptive?
No, that's a great question. The answer is both. In the old days, it was a response to a successful movement. The first comprehensive national effort to promote state preemption was the tobacco industry against the growing non-smokers' rights, smoke-free movement, and that was in the late 80s. Today, it's more preemptive preemption, which is to say, there are parts of the food industry or the beverage industry that want to avoid facing a real grassroots food movement in the United States. And rather than waiting for that movement to get built or at least started, they're passing state preemption in places like Mississippi and Alabama already, Arizona, places that have not done anything yet. So that's a really central question. I've been bad, and I've taken a little bit too much time, so I want to make sure to hit on the things that are of interest to the audience and not belabor this. So maybe are there any other questions or comments at this point?
I have a question, and this is kind of specific to your neck of the woods with a group I'm hoping you're familiar with called the Ruckus Society.
I'm not sure I am.
So those are the, I don't know if it's a fringe group, if that's accurate to say, but they would be with Greenpeace on whaling ships and things like that.
Okay, I've heard the name.
Where do they, that is also a grassroots movement, but it's not in the same positive connotation. So can you explain or talk about the difference between those are kind of groups that may be perceived as being on the fringe versus those that are advocating for more broad scope public health change?
Right. So there's a couple answers to that. It's a great question. Built into our definition of a grassroots public health movement is that it's in the interest of that there's evidence that it's in the interest of the public health and public safety. First of all, so for example, a grassroots movement to stop the vaccination of children would appear to be on the wrong side of the evidence. In other words, and therefore it wouldn't fit our definition of a grassroots public health movement. It's still a grassroots movement, but it's not for public health. I mentioned the gun lobby. The gun lobby is undeniably a grassroots movement. I would argue one of the most powerful grassroots movements in the modern history of the United States. But it's not a public safety movement because to the extent that we have evidence, and there's quite a bit of evidence, including peer-reviewed research, the gun lobby is on the wrong side of the issue, invariably. So it's a grassroots movement. And then there's the other areas of the other major areas in the definition. And so if you look at the ruckus, okay. I can't say that's a great name for a movement. Don't tell them I said that, but it's okay. I would ask you this question: do they fit? Do they have all three of these areas coming together into a movement? I don't know them well enough to say.
I think they do. And I should qualify my comments by saying my only knowledge of this group is that a high school friend and classmate of mine used to be one of their head action grunts, is what they call them. I think they do fit that definition because in some of their protest movements, there's certainly a passion. I know they conduct trainings on kind of passive protests, whether that's banks against banks and proprietary lending or things like that. And I would say they have the capacity because at one of the, I believe it was the Democratic National Convention in Philadelphia, they arrested folks without probable cause as a preemptive movement to ensuring that there was an orderly proceeding in the Democratic National Convention.
I'm so glad we brought this up, and this is why. So, in looking at the strategy piece, let's just say for the sake of argument that they've got capacity. They certainly have passion. But let's look at the strategy piece and specifically goals and being strategic. So, I've described the goal-setting process in an effective grassroots movement, this dialogue that's between grassroots leaders and all of the activists that goes on, this listening that goes on. And the goals there's a certain nature to grassroots goals that they make a difference to activists, but there's something else too, which is to say, if they achieve, if their goals are successful, and I'm talking about the goal, what they should be a single goal that all of their activity is focused on, how is the world going to be a better place? So or another way of putting it is, are those goals focused enough and strategic enough that if they were to wake up and have succeeded in what they're trying to, in what their goal is, would the world be a better place? Okay. This is a great, you just keep them coming. This is really great question. I'll tell you why. Because we talked a little bit about evaluation, if not today, if not now, in an earlier session today. And really, ultimately, the way to evaluate a grassroots movement, to evaluate whether it's been effective, whether it's been successful or not, is could your mom, could your sister, could your roommate from college, roommate from college, look at the world and say, holy cow, it's radically changed. I mean, if you were to light a cigarette in this room, people would not just think that you were breaking the policy of the University of Colorado, they'd think you were stark raving mad. So I think going back to this campaign, or whatever it is that you're referring to, this grassroots action, which it undoubtedly is, the question is, can someone who's not in public health, someone who's not in public, say, look at the world and say, wow, this is a fundamental change. Seatbelts, not universally successful, but when I was a kid, people didn't wear seatbelts. So there are numbers of examples. With this one, and I suppose you could say of this with some of the recent political movements in the U.S. and elsewhere, that they've had protests, they've disrupted meetings, but I don't look at the world and say, wow, those corporations are really on their knees now. I mean, but these are wonderful questions and wonderful comments.
Should we see if there are any questions from Colorado Springs?
There's one behind you.
Oh. Well, let's see if there are any from Colorado Springs first. I don't know what they have to do with technologically to ask one. I'm going to assume silence means no. So
I was just wondering, passion in my experience can be matched with burnout when you get a whole bunch of people who are activists and they're really engaged in something, but that can burn, from both ends. What do you do at that capacity, the management level, the organizational level, to be strategic about preventing burnout so you can continue to engage that passion in a grassroots movement?
That's another great question, and there's a couple answers to that, more than a couple. One is that if you win in a movement, it can counter burnout. So in other words, if you're in a movement that's not making progress, that you're trying to change something. This is sort of maybe a bad example, but we have talked earlier in the day in a class about a budding movement around preventing sexual violence on university campuses, and that passion is very important. The problem is highly preventable. And I believe there are things that can tangibly be done at the campus level, certainly at the municipal level, that can make real, measurable progress and change policies that matter around alcohol and related issues, as well as directly on reporting and prosecuting and things of that nature. But if you don't have success, and if you're impassioned for your 4 years in college and nothing changes, the fraternities are still doing the same thing, and there's still problems, then of course you're going to get burned out. So that's one answer. But the other answer is, that's part of capacity and management. It means that, if it's a 30-year movement, you need one of two things. You need to have people take sabbaticals. You need good health insurance. And the other part of that is you need new blood. It's really critical to have new people coming into these movements, to have fresh blood, but also to have institutional memory. So it takes people who have been down that road before, but it also is enormously important to have fresh ideas and fresh people. questions or comments? Does that answer your question? Oh, there's a related thing. There's a related thing. Money. One of the advantages of money resources for movements, first of all, having all the money in the world, you can have all of the money in the world from a Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg is not going to build you a grassroots movement. You cannot, if you don't have the other pieces, it's not. However, money can do some very important things for movements. One is to diversify movements. So a movement might be made up of a certain, of representatives of a certain socioeconomic class or certain ethnic profiles. Having money enables you to hire people who can grow the movement in diversity in a lot of different ways. You know, not just in typical ways we speak about diversity, but in having different perspectives that share the same view. Someone who wants to do something about sexual violence on campus, two people who want to do something about sexual violence on campus may come from radically different backgrounds. One may come from a very conservative religious background, and the other might come from a different background, and they may not share beliefs on a lot of things, but they may have exactly the same ideas about what needs to be done about this particular issue. So that's another answer to the burnout is if money is used well to diversify a movement, that can also help, seeing new people come in. So here I go. This is going to work. This is on our website under case studies. And so I'm going to go through it obviously very, very quickly, but you can refer to it yourselves. So unlike 46 states in the U.S. Have preemption, including Colorado, of local authority over firearms and ammunition. The tobacco industry ultimately failed at preempting the tobacco control movement, but the NRA succeeded. Really shortly after the tobacco industry kind of invented state preemption as a national strategy, the NRA saw the wisdom in it and went into every single state, including California, and tried and often succeeded in taking away all local authority over firearms. And so, however, in the handful of states, Hawaii, Massachusetts, California, that do not have state preemption of local authority, there have been vital movements. There are very, very strong firearms laws. California has the strongest in the country. They're pushing up they're getting closer to international standards. They're not there yet, but they're pretty close. And California, in spite of sharing borders with Nevada, Oregon, and Arizona, has significantly lower firearm death rates than the national average. At any rate, this case study, which kind of documents that piece, the piece of the California, it documents the details, the sort of nitty-gritty of how that movement started and was built. And I'm going to just stick to the things that make it distinctive as a successful movement. As we now have every few months, major tragedies in California, and nothing happens. We call for change. And California has typical weak state laws on firearms at that point. And this is an example of where money does interact with grassroots movements. It was not the reason we had a successful movement, but it helped a major California foundation, similar to in structure and history to the Colorado Health Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, made a 10-year investment in violence prevention. They couldn't fund lobbying directly, and they didn't need to. But they did invest in infrastructure, and it was early on, and it was pretty much it was a pretty essential piece to that and helped a great deal. And then there was another tragedy. There was a shooting at 101 California Street in San Francisco. A disgruntled client of a major law firm who had assault pistols came in and killed 8 people and seriously wounded a number of others. And it galvanized a specific grassroots movement in the business community and legal community in California. And at that point, a number of us started really trying to model a statewide gun control movement in California explicitly on the national movement for tobacco control, non-smokers' rights. So we really just said, okay, who are our activists? In this case, it was a lot of people who were survivors and victims of gun violence. And a very special thing, this guy actually with the glasses is named Eric Gorovich, is a lawyer, and he was at he has an MPH from Johns Hopkins and a law degree from Georgetown. He wrote a law review paper that said we thought that California had broad preemption, and no one until him had really sort of challenged that. He wrote a law review article saying, actually, cities and counties in California can do a great deal. And it turned out he was right. The courts, like probably most Americans, really don't like the idea of just taking away local authority just because you don't want people to have a say over their health and safety. And so the courts agreed, you could say, with Eric ultimately, and decided that with few exceptions, we did not have broad preemption. And so that meant that we could, we started getting all of these local ordinances passed, banning Saturday night specials, requiring locking of firearms. Didn't matter. We just got lots of good policies passed. And it really quickly, we kind of scared the gun lobby. The California Rifle Association, which was the NRA's state affiliate, actually closed their office in Sacramento at one point. And they have no influence whatsoever now. And so we took from the local, and this really mirrors, this is what I say, looking at these movements, what's really interesting, and these are all in the United States, and all related to our own system, the similarities are so great that I feel like going through this is okay because it's very similar. You know, at the state level, another really major thing, let me just say this one thing, the residential fire sprinkler, and you'll see this, for example, with fracking as well. Residential fire sprinkler movement was probably 50% Republican and 50% Democrat. It was at least very nonpartisan. Because a lot of these fire chiefs and members of the fire service, these are not liberal Democrats. And I want to be and this is the Republican governor, former U.S. Senator of California, signing major gun control legislation because there's a grassroots movement. Ronald Reagan signed the airline smoking ban. They were still serving cigarettes at all state meals, at all state dinners. It was Barbara Bush, who took cigarettes out of the White House. So believe me, Ronald Reagan and his advisors did not want to sign the airline smoking ban, but they felt they had no choice. This is the death rates. At the beginning of this process, California's firearm death rates are higher than the national average. Today, lower and significantly lower, in spite of the fact that you can drive to Nevada and drive back with a trunk full of guns. In Hawaii, where you don't have a drivable border, gun death, and you may follow this too, and I want to make sure this is accurate. Firearms death and injury rates are radically lower in Hawaii, where they have no preemption and they have strong gun laws. I need to look that up before I say it in public. But I knew this. I was executive director. California having the strongest laws as of 2011, keep on strengthening the laws in reasonable ways. Again, it gets back to the group that was referred to earlier. And the movement in California has actually told legislators at the state level often not to introduce or promote certain kinds of laws because we felt that they were either ineffective or unnecessarily stringent. So not only were we not like lobbying to save legislators from being, recalled or lobbying the legislature, for about 5 years we were asking mostly Democrats to stop introducing gun bills. And now they've come back after Newtown, and with Governor Brown, who's, they're quite effective, I think. They've continued to strengthen the laws. I'm not going to read you the lessons because the lessons are essentially identical to the lessons from the residential fire sprinkler case study and so on and so forth. And I apologize for not leaving more time for that. We're officially at the end, but if you want to take more questions or...
Thing from Colorado Springs?
Carol over here.
So one thing that's always interested me about the gun control movement is that it's a waxing and waning issue. When there's a big mass shooting, everyone's like, we need to take care of this. And then, months, a year passes by and we forget about it again. So in your work and maybe from the California movement, what do they, how do they keep the, kind of like Vika's question, it's not as much burnout as much as we lose interest in the issue, something else comes up. And then also I think something that's important about the gun control issue is it's kind of like this urban versus rural struggle, because in rural populations, you have the farm towns where it's more normalized to have guns. This is kind of a multi-pronged question.
No, I'm following you.
And the racial tensions that in low-income populations, vulnerable populations, where gun violence is more prevalent, they have a whole different side to the story about how to deal with gun violence.
Right. So it kind of gets back to this. Well, first of all, it's a really interesting example because there's been a lot of polling about guns, and so we know a lot about views on guns, and most of the things that matter in reducing firearms injuries and deaths in the policy arena, like firearm registration and owner licensing, which is the same system we have for motor vehicles, are very, very popular with almost every single population. The exception is a little bit, it's geographic, but a little bit white men in rural areas. But even white women in rural areas have high levels of support for the kinds of policies that matter. Short of a complete ban on the sale and ownership of handguns, for example, which doesn't poll too badly, but it doesn't have a majority. And so the support is there. What's not there is that it's the worst thing you can do. The worst thing you can do to build a grassroots movement is to get all of these advocates, women, for example, in the Million Mile March, excited and say, we can do it. Yes, we can. And then make all the wrong strategic decisions. For example, proposing, after Newtown, the president said, we need universal background checks through Congress, and invited the survivors and victims of Newtown to the White House for a press conference. And knowing full well, with his education from Harvard, that there was not a single chance that legislation could pass the U.S. House of Representatives like that. And so if you had to choose a way to kill a grassroots movement, it's to ask the grassroots to work hard on something that's impossible. And so you've even seen some erosion in the numbers, the support numbers, but not too much. So that's one answer. You asked a lot, and of course, and as I said before, to reiterate, if you have no success, burnout is somewhat inevitable because you feel like it's impossible. Does that somewhat answer some of your questions?
I know that we're out of time, and I'm worried that maybe is another group trying to get into the room. Is that correct? So we need to wrap up, but I'd like to thank you all for braving the cold to come, and Mark for joining us today and giving a really interesting talk.
Thank you very much for coming in spite of all. And thank you for the wonderful comments and questions.